What if everything you learned about your own origins turned out to be only part of the picture? Not false, exactly, just far more incomplete than anyone let on, buried in the soil of the Indian subcontinent, locked inside ancient bones encoded in DNA strands old enough to remember a vanished world. There's a story that's been waiting to be told. For over 200 years, scientists have argued about where Indians came from. Textbooks have offered tidy conclusions. Politicians have twisted those conclusions into weapons. And yet, the more researchers dig the stranger and more unsettling. The real answer becomes, this isn't the version you grew up hearing. This is the version written into your blood. It's a question that has haunted historians, archaeologists, and geneticists for generations, and on its face, it sounds simple. Where did the people of India originally come from? You'd expect that in an era when we can sequence a full human genome in hours, we'd have a clear answer. By now, India is one of the most genetically and culturally diverse nations on Earth, home to roughly 5,000 distinct ethno-linguistic and religious communities. Sit with that number for a second. That's not just diversity, that's a civilization stacked on civilizations, a population built from layer after layer of earlier populations, a genetic record so dense that until recently we simply lacked the tools to read it. And that's where the accepted story starts to fall apart. The most recent genetic analysis pushes Indian ancestry back to an out-of-Africa migration roughly 5,000 years ago, a journey during which early humans interbred with Denisovans before scattering across Eurasia 50,000 years. When people picture Indian history, they usually think of the Mughals, the British colonial era, maybe the Indus Valley civilization, some 4,000 or 5,000 years back, but the genetic record actually opens far earlier than any of that. At the very moment modern humans were first stepping out of Africa into an Ice Age world India's story is a few millennia old. It's a 5,000-year epic of movement, collision, survival, and reinvention, and that's where things really get interesting. A team led by researchers at UC Berkeley has just completed the most thorough genomic study of Indian populations ever conducted, published in the journal Cell on June 26, 2025. Their work uncovers a 5,000-year history of migration and genetic blending that still shapes disease patterns across the subcontinent today. This wasn't a small sample. SIZE researchers sequenced genomic data from more than 2,700 individuals spanning nearly every region, language group, and community in India. It's an unprecedented scale for South Asian genomics. And this kind of study doesn't just tweak old conclusions, it overturns them. What most people miss is that this research doesn't merely answer old debates. It exposes how badly those debates were framed to begin with. For decades, the conversation around Indian origins has been dominated by two rival camps. One side argues that Bronze Age migrants from the Eurasian steppe, sometimes labeled Aryans, sometimes Proto-Indo-Europeans, pushed into the subcontinent between roughly 2000 and 1500 BCE, bringing Sanskrit Vedic religious practice and a new genetic signature that reshaped the population. The other side, especially among Indian nationalist historians, insists there was no such invasion, that the Sasald Aryans were never outsiders at all, but a population that had been there all along. Much of that resistance comes from the theory's uncomfortable ties to old colonial narratives about conquering Aryan invaders. But here's the twist: the ancient DNA doesn't fully back either camp. What it actually shows is something messier, older, and far more compelling than either side wanted to admit. This isn't a single migration story, and it isn't a purely indigenous one. Either, it's a layered history built from at least 3 separate ancestral populations whose lineages merged and collided over tens of thousands of years to produce one of the most genetically intricate populations on the planet. Most Indians today trace their ancestry to 3 founding groups: Neolithic Iranian farmers, Eurasian steppe pastoralists, and South Asian hunter-gatherers. Read that twice: 3 distinct populations arriving at different moments, each leaving its own fingerprint on the modern Indian genome. This isn't one origin story, it's a convergence, a slow, sometimes brutal meeting of worlds spanning millennia. The oldest and least recognized of these groups is one most people have never even heard of. And that obscurity is its own kind of historical erasure. Researchers call them the ancient ancestral South Indians, or AASI, the original inhabitants of the subcontinent, hunter-gatherers. Descended from that first African exodus some 5,000 years ago, long before writing cities or farming existed anywhere. These were unsampled indigenous populations, distantly related to the Andamanese hunter-gatherers, who later mixed with Iranian farmers to form the ancestral South Indians, a lineage that would go on to blend with steppe pastoralists. The closest living relatives of these first inhabitants are the tribal communities of the Andaman Islands populations, whose geographic isolation preserved genetic signatures long since diluted on the mainland. Looking at an Andamanese person today is, in a sense, looking at a living trace of the very first humans to walk the Indian subcontinent. 5,000 years ago, the oldest human lineage in South Asia hasn't vanished, it survives, not in monuments or scripture, but in living people. Then came the farmers. Earlier research places the arrival of Iranian farmer descendants on the subcontinent somewhere between 4,700 and 3,000 BCE. These weren't conquerors. They were agriculturalists who had perfected crop cultivation in the ancient Near East and were gradually carrying that lifestyle across the ancient world. When they reached India, they didn't wipe out the hunter-gatherers already there. Instead, the two groups intermarried and merged, forging a new genetic and cultural identity. Out of that fusion rose one of the ancient world's most sophisticated urban cultures, the Indus Valley civilization. At its height, around 2500 BCE, the Indus Valley was just an archaeological curiosity. It was a network of meticulously planned cities, Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, Rakhigarhi, complete with advanced drainage systems, standardized weights and trade routes, stretching to Mesopotamia and Central Asia. It arguably outpaced anything happening in Europe at the time. Yet for millennia, we barely knew it existed, and even after its rediscovery, we had no idea who these people actually were until ancient DNA cracked the mystery open. In 2019, DNA extracted from an individual buried at Rakhigarhi, Haryana, the largest known Indus Valley site in India dated to roughly 2500 BCE, delivered an unambiguous result. The individual's ancestry combined Iranian-related farmer DNA with ancient South Indian hunter-gatherer DNA steppe ancestry. 0. Not a trace. The people who built the Indus Valley cities, who traded with Mesopotamia and developed one of antiquity's great writing systems, had no genetic link whatsoever to the Central Asian steppe migrants who would arrive centuries later. They were entirely their own population, descended purely from the original blend of hunter-gatherers and Iranian farmers. And this is where everything shifts. If the Indus Valley population carried 0 steppe ancestry in 2500 BCE, yet nearly every modern Indian carries substantial steppe ancestry. Today, something dramatic must have happened after the civilization's decline began around 1900 BCE, something that permanently altered the genetic makeup of the entire subcontinent. The ancient DNA spells out exactly what that was. This new ancestry originated in the grasslands of what's now Ukraine, Russia, and Kazakhstan, and genetic evidence pinpoints its arrival in India to a narrow window between roughly 2000 and 1500 BCE. Consider what it means for an entire genetic lineage to surge into a region within what is, on a historical timescale, essentially an instant. These were the Yamnaya pastoralists, nomadic herders whose genes and likely languages had already spread across Europe and Central Asia before they ever reached India. They were mobile, expansionist, and remarkably successful at establishing themselves in new territory, and the genetic evidence hints at an uncomfortable explanation for that success. Much of the steppe-derived ancestry traces through male lineages, meaning steppe migrant men had disproportionately more reproductive success with local women than local men did. A pattern that speaks to the forceful nature of this migration. The science here isn't vague, and it isn't comfortable. This wasn't a peaceful cultural exchange or an open blending of neighboring peoples, an overwhelmingly male-driven genetic signal entering the subcontinent within that tight 2500 BCE window points, to an encounter that, in the words of one leading researcher, could not have been entirely friendly. The Indus Valley population didn't invite this new group, and the encounter was lopsided, politically, militarily, and demographically. Instead, they found that the Indian genome holds an archive of encounters with entirely different human species, going back long before the Indus Valley ever existed. New analysis of Indian genomes reveals ancient genetic contributions from both Neanderthals and Denisovans, not modern human relatives, but separate species. Neanderthals who once lived across Europe and Western Asia, and Denisovans, an enigmatic group whose range scientists are still mapping from fragmentary remains in Siberian and Tibetan caves. Like most non-Africans, Indians carry roughly 12 Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA, but the researchers found that nearly 90 of all known Neanderthal genetic variants present in modern humans turned up somewhere within this dataset, 90%. Present-day Indian genomes hold nearly the entire known catalog of Neanderthal contributions to humanity. That's extraordinary. It suggests that through some mix of ancient migration routes and geography. The subcontinent became a kind of living archive for the earliest chapters of human history. It allowed scientists to reconstruct about half of the Neanderthal genome and a fifth of the Denisovan genome using Indian samples alone, more than any prior study of archaic ancestry has achieved. India isn't just a cultural crossroads, it's a genetic one tracing all the way back to the edges of modern human existence. What's easy to overlook is how directly this connects to health today. Genes inherited from Neanderthals and Denisovans aren't dormant leftovers. Some shape immune function, others influence susceptibility to disease. The wide variety of archaic genetic material found in Indian populations has real implications for health outcomes, including susceptibility to conditions like COVID-19, an encounter between modern humans and their archaic relatives. Tens of thousands of years ago on the plains of Eurasia is still influencing who falls ill and who doesn't in India today. The past isn't behind us, it's woven into us. There's one more thread to this story, and it's one the Indian government has decided it can no longer avoid. A new initiative run by the Anthropological Survey of India under the Ministry of Culture aims to reconstruct South Asia's population history using both ancient and modern genomic data. The project will analyze 300 ancient skeletal remains recovered from sites across India and Pakistan, including Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, Burzahom, and Lothal, the great settlements of the ancient world. Most of these remains come from excavations conducted between the 1920s and late 1950s. They've sat in museum storage for nearly a century, and now, for the first time, India will extract and read their DNA. This is no routine research project. It's politically loaded from the outset. Some of the remains may date to a window roughly 3,500 to 3,800 years old. The same era when Yamnaya steppe pastoralists, once labeled Aryans, are believed to have entered India, a migration many historians link to the origins of Sanskrit. The timing is anything but coincidental. These are bones from precisely the period at the center of the migration debate. Whatever their DNA reveals, it will be impossible to keep politically neutral. It will either reinforce or unsettle narratives, deeply woven into modern Indian identity. Early results point to genetic continuity between ancient and modern populations in India without dramatic disruption. That word continuity will land very differently depending on who's listening. To nationalist historians, it may read as vindication proof that Indians are fundamentally indigenous and that outside migrations didn't reshape the subcontinent's genetic foundation. To geneticists who've spent decades tracing the steppe migration, it calls for careful interpretation. Continuity at the deepest ancestral layer doesn't erase the reality of later migrations layered on top of it. The Indus Valley genetic signature does run through nearly every modern Indian. That's real continuity. But the later steppe ancestry tied to Sanskrit, caste structures, and Indo-European languages is just as real and just as present. Even with everything researchers now understand about India's population origins, major gaps remain. Scientists still know very little, for example, about the communities who cultivated rice along the Ganges thousands of years ago, who they were, where they came from, and how they connect to the hunter-gatherers. Indus Valley farmers and steppe migrants already identified. Every question this research answers seems to spawn two more. And then there's the newest wrinkle. The paper published in October 2025 in the European Journal of Human Genetics suggests the picture may be even more complex than 3 ancestral groups. The authors argue that ancient India's genetic landscape was likely far more layered than previously assumed, and that further ancient DNA sampling could reveal additional deep ancestries, not just 3 founding populations, but possibly more lineages so thoroughly absorbed into the modern Indian genome that only the most advanced statistical methods can detect their former independent existence. As archaeologist Michael Fricchetti of Washington University in St. Louis put it, ancient societies were far more interconnected than we've generally assumed, arguably the single most important insight to emerge from this whole body of research. It shatters the old idea that early populations lived in isolated, static, self-contained bubbles. The ancient world was a set of sealed compartments. It was a network. Farmers from what's now Tajikistan, for example, were trading with and marrying into Indus Valley communities thousands of years ago.